Last time we went over the characteristics of the neonate, so that baby during that first month of life when it's still considered a newborn. Today we're going to go over the physical development of the infant from about birth to a year. So we're going to start with the importance of tummy time. Now, when the baby's awake, you need to put them on their tummy for short periods of time. In the beginning, it'll be like 10-15 minute kind of stretches. And most babies don't like it at first because they can't lift their head and they can't see what's going on. But they'll eventually kind of get used to it. Once they're about 6 months old, they probably need about an hour of tummy time. Now, I don't mean an hour like from start to finish, just an hour throughout the day where they're on their tummy. The reason we do this is because it helps develop core muscles in their neck, their back, and their shoulders. All right, eventually you want him to be like this little guy where he can hold up his neck all by himself, and being on their tummy helps with that. It helps them meet those developmental milestones sooner, like rolling over, sitting up, cruising, creeping, crawling, and walking, because they're developing those core muscles. And then it can prevent things like flat head syndrome. That's called positional plagiocephaly, which is a huge long thing. But some babies, when they're always on their back, they kind of get a funny shaped head in the back where it's flat. Tummy time will stop that because they're not laying on their back all the time. And then another thing it prevents is twisted neck syndrome. Now, the typical sequence that an infant follows is first they lift their head all by themselves when they're on their tummy. That happens at about 2 months. Right? About 6 months they roll over. When they start to creep, that's when they can push themselves around on their stomach. So if you look at this little guy right here, they kind of look like an inchworm, but they're using their stomach muscles to crawl across. Some babies actually do it on their back instead of their stomach, which looks really weird. You think they're going to break their neck, but that's how they move around. All right, once they can push up onto their hands and knees, that happens at about 9 months. That's crawling. Then they cruise. This is where they walk, but they hold on to objects for support. So it could be their parents' hands, or it could just be the furniture, like they cruise along the coffee table and the sofa, the kitchen chairs, but they're holding on to things. And then the last thing is walking, and that happens at about 18 months. Now, that's not to say that some babies don't walk at 9 months. Some of them do. Some just get to these physical milestones faster than other babies. All right, their eye development. It's important to have things that they can look at. So a slow moving mobile above their crib or their bassinet helps them focus those eye muscles and get them stronger so that they have better vision. Remember, a newborn can't see very far away, so it's important that they have things to look at, excuse me, so that they can develop those eye muscles. Now, infants like bright colors with really strong contrasts. All right, so black and white, all right, navy blue and white, something that has really strong contrasts. I know we spend a lot of money and a lot of time on pretty pastel kind of things, but babies prefer these bright contrasting colors. Really simple, right? There is not like a cute cartoon character in the bunch. The other thing they like to focus on is a simple drawing of the human face, because the human face has natural contrast where your eyes are, your nose, your mouth. And so if you have these kind of bright contrasts, they are just going to stare at them as they try and make out what it is. So the human face and then just different patterns are more interesting for infants. Right, now there are 2 different feeding options. You can breastfeed or you can bottle feed, and your assignment today is going to be to kind of research the pros and cons of each and then submit it through Canvas. Now, you can introduce solid foods at about 6 months. Sometimes doctors will have you started a little bit earlier depending on how big your baby is and their appetite level, but the guideline is 6 months. Their first food is usually iron fortified cereal, and you just thin it with a little bit of breast milk or formula so it's super runny, and then as they get better at eating it, you just kind of decrease the amount of liquid you're adding to make it a little bit thicker. But at first it's really runny. All right, then most pediatricians recommend that you start vegetables, so like carrots or sweet potatoes, those kinds of things. Then you can introduce fruit. Now, however you decide to do it, they recommend that you introduce foods one at a time to check for allergy. And the guideline is kind of 3 days. So let's say you introduce apples. Okay, you need to wait 3 days before you introduce bananas. All right, and then wait 3 days and introduce sweet peas. All right, that way if they're allergic to something, you're going to catch it. Whereas if you go day 1 apples, day 2 bananas, day 3 sweet peas, and all of a sudden on day 4 they have a rash, you're not going to know which food it was that caused that rash. So introduce a food, wait 3 days, and then you can introduce another food. Right, when they start feeding themselves, it's about 8 to 10 months old. The first food that most babies get are Cheerios or those little Gerber puffs because they're small pieces. They're easy to break or mash. You shouldn't give them anything that they need teeth for because a lot of babies don't have teeth until they're over a year old, so it needs to be relatively soft. Give them teeny tiny amounts. They don't need big servings of food. Their stomachs are still pretty tiny. And then watch them constantly, right? Because they're just figuring out this whole eating thing and it's really easy for them to start choking on something, even a Cheerio. So watch them. All right, one of the sad things that can happen is called SIDS. And SIDS stands for Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. And it's the unexplained death of an infant under 1. They aren't sure why it happens. They think maybe the baby forgot to breathe, it's smothered with something. It's just the unexplained death. Now, there's a campaign to kind of prevent that, and it's been going on since about 1992, and that is that infants should sleep on their back. When you put an infant in their crib or their bassinet, it needs to be on their back. Once they can roll over, you don't have to worry about that because a lot of times once they can roll over on their own, they'll end up on their stomach, but you put them in the crib on their back. And there shouldn't be any pillows, blankets, or stuffed animals in the crib. I know that Pinterest has told us that nurseries need to be really elaborate and decorated with all kinds of soft, fluffy things, but it's dangerous. All right, it's just the sheet, maybe one receiving blanket that they're swaddled in, or you can get something called a sleep sack, which kind of looks like a blanket with a zipper. All right, but they shouldn't have anything in that crib so that there's nothing for them to smother against. Now, at the end of a year, the infant is going to triple their birth weight. So if they weighed 7 pounds at birth, by the time they're a year old, they're going to weigh about 21 pounds. And then their height or their length should increase by 1/2. So if they were 20 inches at birth, they're going to be about 30 inches when they're 1. So it's going to increase by 1/2. All right, please go to Canvas. There's a couple of questions I want you to answer, and then I want you to look at the pros and cons of breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. And I will talk to you next time. Bye.